Okay, so hopefully you can now see my screen. It should say supporting children affected by trauma. And hopefully you can also hear my voice. If there's any issue, please get on your microphone or the chat box and let me know. So my hope today is to first look at a few definitions, try to define trauma and also some related terms, and also just try to provide some clarification between some of those terms. Then I want to look at mitigating factors in regards to trauma. Then moving into behaviors that staff at school might experience with children who have a trauma history. And then looking at how trauma can affect the brain and different ways and theories of explaining trauma and how it affects our perspective and how our brain functions. And then moving into some classroom strategies that you can try if you wish. And then when I've done this presentation before, I have moved into the topic of vicarious trauma. And today we are blessed to have Erin Manning joining us. She is our health and wellness representative for Chinook's Edge. And so she would like to just speak a little bit about how her role at Division can also support this topic. And so I will leave those pieces in the presentation so you can still use some of the links that I've provided for vicarious trauma, but I won't go into as much detail in it today so that we can hear from Erin. Okay, so getting started with some definitions. If you look up trauma, there's actually quite a few different ways you can define it. And so I thought I would include some of the definitions here that I found really aligned with my thinking. So the first definition, which I think is a Latin translation, is trauma means to wound. Another definition is it can mean an overwhelming force that renders a person helpless, and the effects last well beyond the presence of the threat. Another one is when an experience depletes a person's capacity in a catastrophic way. And finally, trauma can overwhelm a person's ordinary coping mechanisms. It can interfere with their memory, their trust in the world, and their sense of self. Post-traumatic stress disorder. So this is a diagnosis that comes right out of the Diagnostical Statistical Manual. And in order to be diagnosed with this, you have to meet very specific criteria. And I thought I would also note that you can be diagnosed with this as a child. They do change the criteria slightly for those who are 6 and under. There's some debate out there that there should be a diagnosis that takes into account developmental approach and trauma that can occur on a more chronic basis and occurs at a young age. The thought is that PTSD doesn't really do a good job of encompassing that, but at present, this is what we have. So to get this diagnosis, you need to have had some sort of exposure to violence, a threat of violence or harm and injury to self or others. The second one, intrusive symptoms. Intrusive symptoms are basically things like memories or flashbacks, nightmares that are quite distressing. They're involuntary, and sometimes they can happen in unexpected ways. They're unwanted and they arrive very unexpectedly. The third one, avoidance of a similar stimuli. So you might find that somebody who has PTSD is very uncomfortable being in a place that is similar or returning to the place where the original event occurred, or being around a person or a thing that is associated with the original trauma. Fourth, negative alterations in mood and cognition. So this is just about symptoms of depression potentially, or other symptoms that can be associated with mood that are atypical for that person. And then alterations in arousal and reactivity. So a person might over or underreact to stress or stimuli, such as noise, crowds, or just any stimuli in general. And then finally, that all of these symptoms lead up to difficulties with functioning in your daily life. So causes clinically significant stress. So I'm just going to quickly check in with the chat box, make sure that there's no issues, and see if there's any questions just yet. I don't see anything, so here. Moving on to trauma-informed. As a term, this is something that a lot of professional development companies, services like to attach this. It's, I would say, a very much up-and-coming term. And when you look it up, there are also quite a few definitions you can find for this term. And so here are a few that I really liked. Trauma-informed means taking into account an understanding of trauma in all aspects of service delivery, and placing priority on safety, choice, and control. Another perspective is it's similar to harm reduction in that the goal is to avoid further traumatization or re-traumatization. Third, establishing a pace that is unique to an individual and that feels safe to them. And then finally, trauma-informed is more of a way of being in a relationship rather than a specific treatment strategy or method. Re-traumatize. So this one is about when an individual experiences an event that reflects the earlier or the original trauma, and that experience of powerlessness and a loss of control. Okay, so next what I'd like to try to do is clarify some differences between terms that are sometimes confused or are similar. So secondary trauma can be described as the emotional duress that results when an individual hears about firsthand trauma experiences of another. Vicarious trauma, although similar, it is a response to an accumulation of exposure to the pain of others. So I would say that this one is perhaps the most relevant to staff who work with children who have been traumatized. And then finally, developmental trauma results from exposure to early ongoing or repetitive trauma as infants, children, and youth. This often occurs within the child's caregiving system and interferes with healthy attachment and development. Moving on to intergenerational trauma. This describes the psychological or emotional effects that can be experienced by people who live with trauma survivors. Coping and adaptation patterns developed in response to trauma can be passed from one generation to the next. The transmission of historical oppression and its negative consequences across generations. And then the final concept here is trauma events that began years prior to the current generation and has impacted the ways in which individuals within a family understand, cope with, and heal from trauma. These unhealthy behaviors then become a normal way of raising children within the family. So what often comes to mind there is our Aboriginal population and their experiences with residential schools. However, it can also be more specific to family-based systems, and you might see a family that struggles with patterns of addiction through different generations, or there are different forms of abuse that are also related to trauma and can be considered intergenerational trauma. Okay, moving into mitigating factors. So mitigating factors are basically things that can increase or decrease the likelihood of being affected by a trauma experience. And you may have heard in the news or read about how when we have individuals who return from serving in the military and being exposed to a war situation, or we have emergency responders or crisis response workers who return from an event, and some appear to be coping well and managing, and others qualify for a diagnosis of PTSD, and why it is that some people have this response and others seem to cope well. And so the theory is that some of these factors are at play and explain why you see such a spectrum of responses to potentially traumatizing events. So first we have is proximity. So physically, how close were you to the event? Duration, which is about how long did the event last? Degree and intensity of the event. The relation to the perpetrator, so whether that person is a known person, a family member, or whether they're a stranger. The behavior and reaction of others. So this is particularly relevant for young children. If they see how their parents are reacting and their parents are coping well, that gives them some very helpful cues. Whereas if their parents are breaking down and not doing well, that can be quite scary for them. People are also affected by whether they have a belief that the event could happen again, or whether this is a one-time event and there's no chance of it happening again. Personality and genetics can play into this, coping strategies. And so again, age is important here. Typically, we tend to have more coping strategies as our brain matures and we get older. Psychological condition at the time. So where is our mental health when it happens? Supportive relationships and whether they are accessible or not. Belief system and culture, which we grow up in. And then the meaning a person attributes to the event. So the stories we tell ourselves in terms of whether we deserve this event or it happened for this reason, or whether this was a by chance, can very much affect how we conceptualize the event and make meaning out of it. And then finally, whether regression is repressed. I thought this one was interesting. So regression refers to when a child or a youth starts to display behaviors that are more typical of a younger person after a traumatic event. And some research has gone into this, and it's basically the brain's way of trying to make sense of the event. And if it occurs, it's not necessarily a bad thing or an indicator or symptom of severe mental health, especially if it only happens for a short amount of time, and that it's best to not interfere with that kind of behavior. If a student is exhibiting this kind of stuff, of course, you want to report it to parents and other professionals, but that it's not necessarily a negative thing. Okay, so what might it look like in the classroom? What are some behaviors that are typical of a student who has a trauma history? And there's quite a range, and you might even notice that some of these behaviors contradict each other. And so it's not a fully inclusive list, and I wouldn't say that if you see these behaviors, it necessarily means that the student has been traumatized, because some of these behaviors also fit under other categories, other diagnoses, other problems. So you might see decreased attention and concentration. A student might be clingy, anxious, hypervigilant. They might be combative. They might seem to be seeking out conflict or appear angry and aggressive most of the time. You might find that the student doesn't come to school that often, or that they are late. You might notice that they have memory difficulties, especially short-term memory difficulties. Executive functioning can be affected, so their ability to plan and organize, stay focused, and follow through with activities and assignments. And then you might also see that they have fears and worries about the safety of themselves, their family members, or others. And the list continues. You might see a student who really struggles to trust people, a student who appears to crave escalation, seek triggers. It might be that they have a decreased ability to respond and interpret appropriately to social cues. They might have complaints about tummy aches or headaches, or you might have noticed that they have a really strong reaction to blood or injury of themselves or others, or they have no reaction at all. Decreased academic performance, difficulties regulating their emotions. They have an inability to self-soothe, whereas perhaps before the event, if it's been a recent traumatic event, they had that ability. You might notice that they have a lack of emotions. So they appear to not respond appropriately to events that would cause other children to laugh or be sad or have an emotional response of some sort. You might see that they recreate the event, they talk about it, you might see it in their play or their drawings. You might notice that they over or underreact to sensory stimuli. So loud noises might cause them to have a strong reaction, or you might notice that they don't react at all. It's as if they haven't heard it or seen it. They may want to talk about death or what it's like, or what to expect after someone dies. Or finally, sleep disturbances. So they might look like they're not getting a lot of sleep. They may fall asleep in class, or they may even tell you about having nightmares or a rough night. So at the bottom there is a link to a resource that comes out of Australia, actually, and it's a PDF that goes into what are typical developmental markers for different ages, and then it also talks about what are some typical traumatic responses that you can expect from children at different ages. So I like it in that it breaks it down by age and provides a little bit more detail. So if you're interested in looking into that further, there's a resource for you. Okay, I'm just going to take a moment to check in again with the chat box, see if anything came up. I'm not seeing any more comments, so I'll keep going. Okay, I just want to move into some perspectives or some approaches or explanations that help us to understand how trauma affects the brain and how it may affect behavior and perspective on life in general. So the first one, neuroception, is really about how we use and combine sensation and perception to understand whether people and situations are safe or unsafe. Neuroception is a very quick experience, and it typically happens on a subconscious level. It's related to introception, if you've heard that term. Introception is about being aware of your internal state and internal sensation. Some other areas that you can dig into if you're interested more in this is polyvagal theory and Stephen Porges. As well as theories and thoughts on the vagus nerve and how stimulating our vagus nerve can help us to regulate and help people who are struggling with a trauma history to regulate. So the idea is that when you have experienced trauma, your neuroception becomes faulty and it starts to tell you that things and places are unsafe when typically you wouldn't have that sensation. Or it can also swing the other way and it just stops working entirely and you don't have any sense at all. Neuroception can also be referred to as intuition, and it's sort of that experience when you first meet somebody or you go into a new place and you just have a sense that perhaps things are off or that you maybe don't like that person, and you may not even know where that information is coming from, because like I said, it's a very subconscious process. Private logic is about how we view ourselves, our relationships, our community, and it makes up our view of why we think we are in the world and how the world works. If we grow up with experiences of fear and abandonment and neglect, then we often see the world as a scary place and view ourselves as very powerless and not having a lot of control, sort of a victim view. Alternatively, if we grow up experiencing love, acceptance, respect, having our basic needs met, we're more likely to be confident, curious, and motivated to learn and engage in social situations. Another way to think about private logic is like an invisible backpack that you carry around with you wherever you go. And all of your interactions and your experiences go into that backpack, and they inform how you respond and react to any future event. The backpack is influenced by genetics, your culture, your gender, physical health, and all those other factors. Your backpack can also be unpacked as you get older and your brain develops, and you can reconceptualize events and things. An example of doing that process would perhaps be therapy. It's a lot of work to unpack one's backpack and look at where beliefs come from, and create new narratives, but it's a worthwhile process in this perspective. And then finally, this idea of I am safe versus I feel safe. And this explanation tries to point out the difference between objective safety and subjective safety. So if you are a classroom staff member and you try to set up a class to be a very safe and welcoming environment, and on the first day of school, everybody arrives, you're still going to see a spectrum of responses. You'll have some students who are very excited to be there, they're ready to engage, they're talking, they're curious, and you'll have other students who are very quiet, they're very cautious, they are only ready to observe, they're not really in a place of being ready to engage just yet. And what it tries to do is point out that safety is a very subjective experience, and it's about perspective, and that if you have a history of trauma, your understanding and your sensations around safety are going to be very different. And that even though we might experience safety, we shouldn't assume that others feel the same. So I hope that makes sense. I'm going to talk a little bit now about Maslow, who I would say is most famous for his triangle and his hierarchy of needs. And so this can also be related to trauma. The first level there in his triangle is physiological needs, and this is about basic needs of food, shelter, clothing, sleep. The second level is safety needs, and this is kind of where the trauma piece comes into, and whether we feel safe or not. Third is about belonging and love. And then fourth, esteem needs. So feeling valued, worthy, respected by yourself and others. So these first four levels can be referred to as deficiency needs, or I've also heard them called deprivation needs. And what he's trying to say is that these needs absolutely must be met before we can move up any higher in the triangle. So cognitive needs, including learning, executive functioning, using our frontal brains, is really not available if these other things haven't been met. And as I'm sure you've experienced, we have kiddos who arrive at school who are very much struggling at these levels. And so what he's trying to say is that although our primary mandate is education, and that is our goal, it's really tricky to ignore these initial needs if we want students to be on board with learning. So if you're interested in that, I have provided a link at the top to an article that provides a little bit more detail on that perspective. Okay, I'll do a quick check-in with the text chat box again. See if there's any comments. Okay, I'm not seeing any. So moving into classroom applications, what are some strategies, things to try to help these kiddos regulate? So my first strategies, I tried to group them under the umbrella of grounding because I think they all fit there. And so I'm working with the definition of grounding grounding is about using your senses to bring yourself into the present and into your body. Grounding is about establishing personal safety, choice, and power. And finally, grounding is about bringing yourself out of fight or flight and into your upstairs brain. So another way to talk about it is it's about being present in the here and now, and not only having your body in a place, but also your mind present in that place. So these next activities are all about trying to focus on those things. So the first idea is about temperature. And some examples are holding ice cubes in your mouth or your hands, or alternatively using warmth, such as a warm blanket, to calm or regulate a nervous system. If you're interested in this little piece, I would encourage you to look more into the diving reflex or the diving response. And so some research has been done into that that shows that when we are exposed to colder temperatures, our body has this involuntary reaction of slowing down the heartbeat and consuming less oxygen. And the primary purpose of that is for survival. You're in a cold situation, and in order to get through, this is what you need to do. But research has shown that this process also resets the nervous system and calms a person who's really anxious. Taste is another strategy. For example, placing a pinch of salt on your tongue and just holding it there, or eating a sour orange or any other sort of strong sensation. And the idea is that it can very much bring a person into the present moment, forces the brain to focus on something other than their thoughts and their distress. Touch is also similar, something that is soft like a feather, or something stimulating or prickly. And I put an example picture there of one of those head massagers. If you've ever had the experience of one of those, you know what I'm talking about. The ends of the massage points there move down your head, and it's very, very difficult to focus on anything else that's happening when you have one of those things on your head. And so touch can work that way, in that it just brings your attention to sensation rather than panic or thoughts and fears. Pressure, so massage, deep pressure activities, pressing down into the ground with your feet, body, or your hands. This one's kind of been borrowed from the occupational therapy world, and if you have an opportunity to talk to an OT about this, I encourage you to do so. The idea is that we have receptors in our joints that receive signals when you're participating in these activities, and these signals move through our nervous system and regulate us. And so perhaps you've even experienced students who respond really well and calm down when they receive these sort of activities. Movement and proprioception. So examples: hanging upside down, brain gym, yoga, exercise. I read a really interesting research article about youth who like to do their homework with their papers and their work on the floor, and their elbows and head on the floor, and then their feet and legs on the couch. And the idea is that most parents are like, this looks like you're not taking your homework seriously, but they found that it's actually quite regulating for the body to be in this position. And another thing that comes to mind are those tables that you can attach your body to in order to realign your back. They have also been shown to have regulating effects on the nervous system as well. Breathing, slow and deep, soothes the parasympathetic nervous system. This is probably one of the primary recommendations for people who struggle with panic attacks. And it's one of the most effective things besides anxiety medication for controlling panic attacks. The benefits of breathing over medication, for example, is that breathing is something that you can control, and medication is something that if you forget it, it would just make the situation worse. But breathing has also been shown to work in other situations. If you're interested in this one, I would encourage you to look up belly breathing or diaphragmatic breathing. And then finally, mindfulness, meditation visualizations. This is about using your 5 senses to focus on an experience that will ultimately regulate your nervous system. If you go on YouTube and you put in visualization scripts, meditation activities, there's a lot of stuff out there. Some of it is not as good a quality as others. A person that you could also look into who is a big deal in the mindfulness world is Jon Kabat-Zinn. So just a cautionary note about some of these activities. If you're working with an individual who has a trauma history or an individual who has sensory sensitivities, some of these activities might actually be distressing or be too stimulating. So just being aware that go ahead and try them, but make sure that you are offering lots of choice and you are explaining what your hope is, what is your goal, and what your process looks like, just to try to give students a little bit more information about what's happening, what the end goal is, so that they're less likely to be scared or nervous about it. Okay, so moving outside the umbrella of grounding, here is a topic to consider. So I have a link here to an infographic. Strength-based language. So what this is about is asking us to focus on how we speak about ourselves and others. And so in relation to students, perhaps it's about how we speak to the student, how we speak to their parents, how we speak to our coworkers. And I would say that in the culture of education and Canadian culture, we tend to focus on the negative. And I don't think that that's on purpose. I think it's just our way of being efficient and getting to the point. But what this tries to say is that when we do that, it can be a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy. And that if children are aware of this language, they may start to own it and incorporate it into their self-identity, especially at those ages when they are really working on understanding who they are and forming their self-identity. And I am just as guilty as the next person about using deficit perspective language. It's like a bad habit that's hard to break, or something that you do without really thinking about it. So this infographic is just about sort of focusing on that pattern and looking at ways to change it. So here's some examples at the bottom. Rather than saying what is wrong, saying what has happened. Rather than labeling the issue as controlling, you could say that the individual is trying to find and assert their power. Another example, rather than saying a student is manipulative, you could say that they are having difficulty asking for what they want. So this might seem overwhelming, perhaps intimidating, but even just picking one statement that you know that you say often and that perhaps would benefit from a bit of an overhaul and just focusing on changing one sentence at a time. Okay, moving into co-regulation as another strategy. So co-regulation comes from this idea that when infants are born, they are incapable of regulating their own emotions, their own inner experience, and that they are very much dependent on their caregivers, and that caregivers provide cues through touch, soothing voice, the warmth of being near, an awareness of breath and heartbeat, and perhaps even rocking them. And so co-regulation is this idea that we have children who are above and beyond infancy age who, for whatever reason, cannot regulate, whether they've had a traumatic experience and they no longer have the ability, or whether they never learned how. And so adults, people who are in authority can use their own strategies to influence and support an individual who is struggling. So here's a few ideas to get started on that. Yourself first is just referring to, if you are not in a calm place, you will not be able to help another. And you can't really fake this one. I know I've tried with my own children, and whether it's that neuroception idea, you just can't fake this one. It's also being aware of your breath and exaggerating it so that the other person is aware of it. You can also do this with your pace of talking and movement, just slowing it down and exaggerating it. watching your voice, making sure that it is soft and that your tone is very welcoming and reassuring, getting down to their level in terms of physical space, trying to equalize that power differential, exaggerating body language, facial expression, and if touch is part of the relationship and is experienced as safe, perhaps considering that as well. This is not a strategy for those kids who are about to melt down or are in full meltdown. Obviously, those kids are not even aware of what's going on around them in most cases. And so this would be more something to consider when you first see a student starting to escalate, sort of those first signs of agitation. And then also, it would be important to only do this if you are in close relationship with that student and you have trust between you. Quickly check in with comments and questions here again. Okay, nothing yet. I'll keep going. This strategy, helping to realign perception of self and others. This is maybe borrowed from the cognitive behavioral therapy world, but you don't need to be a counselor or a therapist to do this. So children, people who have experienced trauma often have this perception that they somehow caused the trauma, that they are bad because of their behavior, their extreme behaviors, or that perhaps they even deserved what happened to them. Sometimes they also have a belief that others are out to get them. It's referred to as the hostile attribution bias. So for example, they might experience that you are yelling at them when your understanding of the experience was that you were just using a firm tone. So here are some strategies for helping them to consider again how they see themselves and how they see others. So the first idea is just trying to compliment them often and make sure that those compliments are specific so they know exactly what it was that you appreciated. Giving permission to make mistakes, telling them often over and over again that mistakes are not a reflection of negative character traits, that mistakes are part of learning and growing, and that mistakes grow new brain connections. Bringing attention to their inner voice. So if you're aware of what their inner voice sounds like, perhaps sometimes you even hear some of the things they say. The idea here is being curious about why they have those beliefs. So rather than jumping to contradicting it, saying more about where did that come from or why do you believe that, in the hopes that you'll be able to dig down to what is the core belief behind that, and then hopefully being able to challenge that. Maybe even giving them examples of things you have seen them do or say that very much contradicts this negative perception of themselves or others. And then rewarding effort, not product. So as I mentioned earlier, often academics really suffer. And so if you see them trying really hard and perhaps it's not up to their usual work, just focusing on their efforts rather than what they've accomplished. Emphasizing cooperation over competition. So it's not that competition is bad, but just being aware of what is the ratio of cooperation to competition. Cooperation is often more about building relationships and enhancing trust and respect, whereas competition often tests relationships and pushes relationships. And then also just being sort of aware, having a mental count of how many successes versus failures, and being aware that your perspective of their successes and failures might be very different from theirs, especially if they have that negative view of self. And then finally, growing their community, helping them build relationships with students and staff outside of their classroom can be really helpful. Then you have people that can help with transitions to recess, transitions after school, going home, coming to school, as well as bigger transitions to moving up in grades. Another reason for this is if a student has a really tough morning in a class, when they come out for recess, there are people who are excited to see them and have no awareness of that time. And that can be really helpful. Here's another infographic that you might appreciate. This one is about a process of walking children through a big emotion. And I won't go through it in detail, but it just provides some steps of things you can do. Again, this one isn't really for a student in full meltdown, or even those students who are about to melt down. It would again be for those who are just starting to struggle and appear agitated. You can also use this as an outline of how to debrief an event, help a student to increase their self-awareness, help everybody to understand what happened and what the triggers were, and then perhaps look at how to plan for next time. On this slide, I provided a few videos from YouTube that you might find helpful. The idea here is that when people know more about how their brains work and how their brains respond to trauma and stress, they're more empowered to control their behavior, their choices, and to be aware that they have that. So trying to move them out of the victim state and into the driver's seat, I guess you could say. So the first one is about explaining stress, and it's more appropriate for an adult audience. The second one is stress explained more for youth. The third is fight, flight, freeze, explained for, I'd say, a younger audience. And then the fourth is explaining the idea of flipping your lid and what happens. And that one I thought could be shown to anyone, children, adults. So this brings me to the tricky question of, so what do you do when a kid is in full meltdown? And unfortunately, you might not like my answer, but research and studies say that there's very little you can do to steer their behavior when they are in this state. I thought the Inside Out character was kind of perfect for illustrating somebody who is not in control of their behavior. Really, the biggest intervention here is prevention and trying to avoid this whenever you can. And so having a really good behavior support plan, filling out a kite visual that explains what triggers this student has, what it looks like when they're agitated, what are the signs that they're approaching full meltdown, and then what does it look like when they start to de-escalate and calm down. I would say that you need to be cognizant of your safety, the safety of the students who are around, and then the safety of the student who is melting down. And then I guess the other piece is when the student does calm down, doing a debrief with them and listening again for those themes of, am I a bad person? Does my behavior make me a bad person or an awful human being? Some students will be very vulnerable about this and bring it up. Others will try to hide it and perhaps even try to fill the shoes of being a bad kid because they don't understand that their behavior doesn't reflect who they are or their value as a person. So if you can get into some of those topics, that can be really helpful. Also just reassuring them that this is what you see your role being when they melt down, so that they know that you're trying to take care of their safety and others' safety, and that it's not that they are being abandoned or alone in their struggles, that you are still there for them. So if you can focus on those messages after the fact and in preparation for if this happens again. And then finally, my last strategy, promote play and submersion in nature. So before you accuse me of being flaky, let me just share some of the research on what it says about creative and free play and what it says about spending time in the outdoors. There's a lot of research that says that this is good for us and helps our emotional well-being. Specific things like it reduces inflammation in the body, brings down cortisol levels, which is the hormone associated with stress. It improves memory, boosts immunity. It helps with focus, even in those who struggle with ADHD. And it also reduces the likelihood of diabetes, cancer, and high blood pressure. So it's a big deal. And then just a few devil's advocate questions that often come up. The first one, how do we get through curriculum if we have students who are never regulated? And I'm with Maslow a little bit. You can't get through curriculum if they aren't regulated. I had a professor share with me once an analogy of relationships, and he said that relationships are like a piggy bank, and in order to take coins out of the piggy bank, you need to have first put coins in. And so coins into a relationship piggy bank are building trust, having positive experiences together, getting to know each other, and yeah, just building that trust. And taking coins out are when perhaps you push a kid a little bit to work a little harder, or you challenge them on their behavior when you think that perhaps they are using a little bit of manipulation, and they're aware that some of their behaviors allows them to get away with things. So I guess my short answer is that whenever possible, if you can help them to regulate and provide for those needs, as mentioned by Maslow, it will help you in terms of getting some learning into them. And then finally, if you can build a trusting relationship with this person, that is a big deal and will serve you well. So the second question is, what if they are just manipulating you? And this is a tricky question too. I would say that manipulation and legitimate social emotional issues are not exclusive. They can happen together. Children are still capable of that when they have mental health issues. And so I really think, again, that it comes down to having a relationship with those students and being able to tell the difference. And when you can't tell the difference, I always go to the default of it's genuine. It's not manipulation, because that is the safer approach, where you're not as likely to do harm to that relationship and your strategies are more likely to make a difference. And then finally, this isn't happening at home. Maybe school is the problem. I get this one from parents quite a bit, and probably you do too. And my response is, sounds along the lines of, often the school is the problem. At school, there are more people. There's more people telling you what to do, more people in authority. There are more unknowns. You have relationships with some of those people, but some of those people you don't have any relationships with. The sensory input is greatly increased, and the transitions, the changes in environment, people, and activities are ongoing. So school often is way more challenging at home because home just doesn't have those factors. However, I often try to point out that school is very much like a mini society, and if we want our kiddos to function in society, we need to prepare them. And so at school, we try to offer them accommodations and breaks, but exposure to some of these things isn't necessarily a bad thing. And our hope is that we can help them to learn to navigate them so that they are better prepared when they do move on from school and into society. So I hope that those answers are helpful. I'm just going to check in again with our chat box. Okay, nothing new there. So this is where I would move into vicarious trauma. And I provided some resources, and you're welcome to look into those and email me questions if you like. But what I'd really like to do is just give the floor to Erin Manning for a little bit to explain how she kind of fits into this topic. So Erin, if you are there, I will just come out of presentation mode and please share.
Yeah, I am here. I've turned my camera on. I don't know if people can see me. I don't see myself on the grid. Maybe give me a thumbs up, or Adrian, you could just say if you can hear me all right.
I can hear you fine, Erin. I can't see your video, but
okay.
Oh, that's okay if it's not working.
On. Now I've turned it on.
Yes, I can see you. You're good.
Okay, so just to put a face to my name for those of you who perhaps I haven't met, I looked through the list of names and certainly know some of you. And so thanks to Adrian for letting me just pop in during her PD. And I was thinking as I was sitting here, it's kind of a cool story that Adrian and I have. Back in 2007, she and I did a master's program together. So, and kind of lost touch after that. And when I found out that Adrian was coming to Chinook's Edge, that was pretty neat. So kind of a full circle, and then being here together today, pretty neat experience. So just wanted to share that with you. For those of you who don't know me, I have been with the division since about 2013, started in a family school wellness role. And so I have lots of experience in the school and working with kids and supporting teachers and EAs in that capacity. And then more recently have moved into the staff health and wellness side of things, which I really enjoy being able to support staff. I do that on a one-to-one basis often. And so I just wanted to share a little bit about how that could look in relation to this topic. Adrian, you did a great job kind of explaining some of those vicarious trauma pieces as you were talking. And I think really what stood out to me is that the work that we do with students is hard work. And we often do see and hear, experience really difficult things in the course of this work. So whether it's student behavior or disclosures, student disclosures, that was something that I certainly experienced a lot in family school wellness. They can put considerable stress on us. And so, along with vicarious trauma is that concept of compassion fatigue. And so the work that we do is, we care. We care every day. And compassion fatigue speaks to the way that caring sometimes comes at a cost. And so, if we're having difficulty replenishing or feeling like, man, I don't feel as connected to my purpose as I once did. Am I making a difference anymore? Sometimes we might notice that we're losing that sense of maybe hopefulness that we once had. Those kind of things are what we mean when we talk about compassion fatigue. I think sometimes too, though, as an educator, we experience chronic stress. So sometimes we've got those complex kids and things don't necessarily change. And it can be really tiring, and it can impact our own well-being and our own ability to stay regulated. And so what I love about our division is that as we have really begun to pay attention to social emotional learning for our students, that we've also recognized that, man, it's equally as important for us as the adults. And so one of the key pieces, I think, when we talk about compassion fatigue and staying resilient and taking care of ourselves is connection. There's lots of pieces that support us in this work, but the one I just wanted to highlight today is connection. My hope and what I know is that lots of times we do have opportunities to connect with our colleagues around our experiences. Hopefully there are opportunities for you if there's a particularly stressful incident or behavior incident or aggression towards you that has happened with a student, that we have those opportunities to debrief our experience and to be able to express what's going on for us, because it's so critical. And professional isolation, I think, is a really real thing. And sometimes when we're in the midst of those experiences or we're experiencing that chronic stress, that compassion fatigue, we start to doubt our own competency. We don't have the job satisfaction that we'd like. And so connection is just so critical. in moving through that. So I guess what I'd like to really just emphasize today is that as I've worked in this position, I've had the opportunity to support people around compassion fatigue and to support people who maybe aren't getting the debriefing experiences that they need, the debriefing time or conversations, or perhaps depending on what's going on in our individual experiences, we're just recognizing that we need a little bit more of that support, right? Some of us are, especially now during COVID, extremely stretched, playing multiple caregiving roles at home, right, with our own kids. And so depending on what's going on, we may need a bit more support. And I am just wanting you to know that I am available to provide some of that support if there's a gap for you, or if maybe there's an extra need these days. And so just to give you a couple of examples, I've spent time with, I can think of a teacher that I spent time with who she went through something really traumatic this year in her school with a student, and just knew that even though she had the opportunity to kind of debrief that with her colleagues and her administration, she knew that she needed more support and that it had just brought up some other things for her as well. And so she was able to access support, and we worked together. And I can be helpful too in terms of thinking about maybe there's something longer term that you're looking for around support. Homewood Health actually has a specialized trauma care program that any of us in Chinook's Edge can access. So a little bit more of a specialized, comprehensive counseling service that they provide to our staff if necessary. So those are all things that I can help with. If there's any questions or comments, feel free to put them in the chat. If there's something that I haven't been clear about. Because this is being recorded, I just wanted to quickly mention my contact information. So you can reach me via email, which is A Manning, and then the regular CESD, like we all have, or also can call me. And my extension is 7064, and I'm available to provide support around compassion fatigue, around chronic stress in the workplace, and to do debriefing with you if you feel like you're just not getting enough of that in your context. I think that's everything. Thanks, Adrian.
Thank you, Erin. I appreciate you joining us this morning and highlighting some of the tricky pieces of our jobs and highlighting some of the things, the really challenging things that we encounter, and reminding us of some of our resources that are out there. I think that's great. So I just want to open it up to questions right now. Please feel free to put them in the chat box, and myself or Erin can try to answer them. Alternatively, you can also email me with thoughts that may come up. And if you need to go, of course, you're welcome to do what you need to do. I'm sure we all have full days, and I'll just hang out for a bit in case anything comes up. Otherwise, have a good day, everyone.